Thank you for having me here today. Today's talk is going to be, it's called The Certificate Strikes Back. It's how we can kind of leverage things like ADCS to kind of extend the certificate abuse to Entra. My name is Fletcher Davis. I am currently a senior manager of the data science and research team at Beyond Trust. Before that, I come from like an offensive background. I was a principal consultant at CrowdStrike and Mandiant, and my Twitter handle is JimRat. The agenda for today is going to be, kind of in three phases. I think one going to be the foundation phase, kind of explain, at a technical level, the two different components of this attack chain, ADCS and CBA, which is Entra CBA or Entra Certificate-Based Authentication. And then we'll discuss kind of how we can leverage things like Active Directory to pivot into Entra. We have an attack chain, a demo, some posture recommendations, some defensive recommendations, and then some detection strategies. And then lastly, there's some takeaways to go. Quick acknowledgements. I don't know if they're here, but Will Schroeder, Lee Christensen, Jonas, Andy, and you. I'm going to say you. I don't know how to say say his name. Just want to acknowledge the work that they've done. This is an extension of their work. If you get anything from this presentation, this is the kind of the slide that I want to harp on. This concept of bridging silos. The concept of that, organizations are highly complex, and I think in security nowadays, teams are very isolated, kind of siloed in terms of what they focus on and how they secure things. I want to kind of push in this narrative that we should be focusing on trust relationships as well, how these domains kind of interconnect, and how that can be effective for threat response. And so, for example, a lot of organizations that are kind of AD focused, they have an AD kind of Active Directory environment. A lot of times that's synchronizing to things like Entra. But you have to also think about how do those things kind of play into other rules like SaaS and other products. So you can see here we have Active Directory synced to Entra, and that's used to federate access into things like GitHub. Other examples I commonly see in organizations is AD to Okta, and then Okta handling federation or SSO into things like Databricks, Atlassian, etc. But I want to stress the impact that we need to be thinking beyond just one domain, but thinking about cross-domain as a whole. So I'm going to do a brief introduction. I'm probably speaking to the right audience about Active Directory certificate services, but I want to do a quick demonstration and kind of explanation on what it is for those who aren't aware. What is ADCS? For those who aren't aware, it's Active Directory certificate services. It's a server role in Active Directory that essentially functions as Microsoft's public key infrastructure implementation. It allows organizations to issue, to manage digital certificates for things like authentication, encryption, and other key purposes. Key components to be aware of, CA, certificate authority, certificate templates, and digital certificates. We'll kind of explain in the next few slides like what those are and kind of how they work. In this case, certificate authorities are responsible for attesting to the identity of a user, a computer, an organization. They're the core component of Active Directory certificate services. They issue, invalidate, and revoke certificates that are used to do things like authenticate, to digitally sign code. And there's different types of these Windows server. Like Windows servers have different types of certificate authorities, one being enterprise CAs, one being standalone CAs. The deviation being enterprise CAs are integrated with Active Directory domain services, and they can do things like issue certificate templates, while standalones aren't integrated into ADDS, and they do not issue cert templates. You actually have to require all information in your CSR or your certificate request. Common structure that we commonly see. So you can see here we have a 3-tier hierarchy. You have a root CA, intermediate CA, and issuing CAs. This is probably overkill for most organizations. Most organizations, I think, probably shouldn't, but do implement a thing like a singular, just a root CA. And most organizations may implement like a 2-tier hierarchy. 3-tier is probably recommended for kind of flexibility and scalability and security. In this case, a root CA, what that is, it's just a top of the certification authority or hierarchy. It's self-signed by itself. The thing to know is if this is ever compromised, everything that trusts the CA is essentially compromised. You can maximize these things. I think they recommend that you typically keep these offline. Anything that's below a root CA is called a subordinate CA. And that's comprised of 2 types, intermediate and issuing are 2 kind of ways to explain that. Subordinates are just kind of like comprised or used for tiering, scalability, flexibility. Now, I've seen times where a department or location has their own custom CA, and it kind of allows, if this one particular CA was compromised, it kind of minimizes the impact of a full-scale compromise. And these obtain, at least the ones below the root CA, obtain their certificates from the root CA. Quick definition on certificate templates. So this is, like I said before, published by the enterprise CA. These kind of contain predefined properties for certificates upon request. Common things we typically see are things like client authentication, smart card logon, code signing, etc. And these have typically a validity period of 5 years by default. You can customize that as you like, and that's just how long the certificate's valid for, unless it's revoked. Other thing is issuance requirements. Does it require approval upon request? So if I request a certificate, does it require a manager to approve it? Authorized signatures and things of the likes. These purposes, by the way, are defined as called a key usage or extended key usage or application policies. There's a few different ways to kind of define that. So once you've kind of made a request for a cert template, or you've made a request to the CA, you get back what's referred to as a digital certificate, and that's essentially an electronic document, that's cryptographically verifying the authenticity of a user and a predefined purpose. And so this typically binds a public key to a specific identity. The CA actually validates that. This is issued by the CA upon what's called a certificate request, or a CSR. You'll commonly see that. This contains information about the purposes. And so in cases we're going to talk about today, client authentication is kind of the main purpose, and using the certificate to authenticate as a particular user in the environment. So kind of rip this off SpectraOps is certified pre-owned. So it's kind of a little visualization of how this works. We're going to kind of walk through the certificate enrollment process. So as you can see here, we have a client. A client can be a user, a computer, etc. It initiates that certificate enrollment process by generating with a public-private key pair. The public key is then included in the CSR, while the private key is stored locally on the device. So you can see here, we have two keys, one stored locally on the device, one stored in the CSR. This particular certificate request is for the SOCON template that's stored on the enterprise CA. The subject is just a domain user. The purpose of the certificate is just client authentication. So we then make that request to the CA over a handful of network connections. There's different ways to authenticate and connect to an enterprise CA. The CA then performs a series of checks on its end, some including things like, does the template even exist that it's requesting for? Does the information within the request actually make sense and comply with the standards? Does the client who is actually making the request exist? And are they authorized to actually make that request? So in this case here, the template includes things like the EKU of client authentication. The enrollment rights are for anyone who's a domain user, and this requires no manager approval, which is quite common in organizations that I've tested and seen. So we get it approved, then the CA will then issue that certificate back to the user, or the client in this case, and the user then can take that and store it locally on their device. So typically it's stored in the Windows certificate store on the device, and then it can be used for further purposes. Common misconfigurations, I'm not going to harp on this. SpectraOps did an amazing job of kind of going through the different escalation paths and different abuse primitives, but commonly seen as misconfigured certificate templates, where a requester is allowed to specify who their certificate is for upon request. And so you got a low privilege user who's saying, hey, I'm requesting this on behalf of, or as admin in the domain. And so when the certificate is approved and issued, they receive a certificate for an admin user. And so in combination with client authentication, they can use this to authenticate as an admin user in the domain. Other common configuration issues, poorly configured access control issues. So I commonly see a user having access to manipulate or modify the security principle of the template. So you can modify a template to make it vulnerable. The same thing applies also to cert authorities. Same example kind of as before. We have let's just assume here that it's the domain user who has enrollment rights on a certificate template, as well as the certificate authority. Manager approval is disabled, and authorized signatures are not required. In this case, we're going to request, same thing as before, SOCON template, but we're going to specify an alternative SAN. We're going to specify domain admin, right? So same exact process. We send the request to CA. CA makes the checks. As you can see on the SOCON template, it allows us to supply the SAN on request, and then we're issued back a certificate with the misconfigured, with the alternative SAN. So this means that this attacker now can authenticate as that domain admin user to the Active Directory domain. I'm not going to harp on it too much. It's just kind of a brief introduction to Active Directory certificate services as we kind of transition now into Entra. But if you want any resources, I highly recommend the Certified Pre-Owned white paper and the research they performed. So some investigation stuff. CrowdStrike did an amazing white paper on detecting and preventing ESC1. My team at Beyond Trust has done research into that as well. So if you do a simple Google of ADCS abuse, you're going to find a lot of cool research, plenty of things to dive into. I think it's important too, I'm going to take a step back to model things. I'm a big believer in mental models, and I like to model things like graphs. And so this is a very high level. I wouldn't say this is something I'd throw in Bloodhound, but something that I would use to kind of model my current mental models and assumptions. So we'll start with Active Directory before we kind of pivot into Entra, and then how those two domains kind of synchronize. And so in this case, we have a user. User has enrollment rights into two different templates, a vulnerable template and a actual user template. User template being that I can request this cert as myself, and it supports client authentication. Both of those templates are actually published to an issuing CA, and that I also have enrollment rights to. And then there's this particular certificate chain where that issuing CA trusts an intermediate CA, which trusts a root CA, and all of this is kind of within the Active Directory domain. So this is our first boundary. This is kind of the Active Directory, and we'll kind of show shortly how we can cross that boundary to kind of loudly move and escalate privilege. So we're going to talk about Microsoft Entra cert-based authentication. We'll do a pretty deep overview. So what is Microsoft Entra CBA? Well, it's essentially a Microsoft authentication method, one of many. Password, you've got passkeys, FIDO, you've got I think nowadays QR authentication, but it's just another way to kind of authenticate users against the Microsoft Entra tenant. In this case, using X509 certificates. It's part of Microsoft's really push to have customers adopt, phishing-resistant authentication and moving away from traditional kind of on-premise federation services. In this case, like ADFS, which for those who are unaware supports client, certificate-based authentication. Wink, wink. And also works really well with things like conditional access policy to kind of enforce MFA, and as well as other sorts of location-based, managed device-based policies. Here's kind of an example. We're going to walk through kind of a typical authentication flow for users who are using cert-based authentication. So in this case, you have a user on a device. They attempt to access an application. In this case, we'll just call it Microsoft Portal, or Azure Portal. The user then is redirected back to the Entra tenant to sign in. The user enters their name. On the back end, Entra is essentially performing what's referred to as home realm checking, but checks if the user actually has CBA enabled on the tenant, and then does the user actually have it assigned to them. The user then gets a prompt to say, hey, authenticate with a certificate, pretty much. The user Entra then, as part of a mutual TLS authentication, TLS handshake, requests the user to supply their certificate. The user supplies that certificate, and on the back end, Entra performs some validation checks. The user then provides a second, if the authentication policy, we'll talk about that later, is single factor, the user is enforced to, or if the conditional access policy, requires multi-factor, will, be provided to, perform multi-factor through some second form. And once they perform that and they achieve that, they're able to complete the sign-in process. And then the user, if successful, is able to access the application. What that actually looks like is going to be like this. You're going to have a user logging in. They're going to get prompted to use certificate. They do that. They're going to get prompted to provide their certificate under the hood. And this is something you can configure and enable. Microsoft performs something called issuer hints, which essentially allows you to restrict or reduce the amount of results in this box. We'll talk about later how that could be a potential interesting recon technique to enumerate passively certs for or CAs for users externally. And then from there, once you've kind of clicked the one you want and you've been, it's been successful, you get a the typical stay signed in kind of prompt from Microsoft. There's three main components to talk about today. There's the Cert Authority Trust Store, which essentially is configuring trusted CAs in Entra. Then you have username binding policies, which you can think about as I have a certificate that I'm giving to Entra. Entra needs to know how to use it, right? So how does the properties or the and the certificate map? How do they map to Entra users in Entra? And lastly, authentication binding policies, which is determining the strength of the actual certificate. So, a cert could be used for a single factor, it could be used for multi-factor, depending on certain policies in place. So in this case, we'll start with the Cert Authority Trust Store. Cert Authority Trust Store maintains certificate authorities that are trusted for cert-based authentication. There's two types. There's a classic version and there's a preview version. I recommend using the preview version, so does Microsoft. But essentially, it's just a way of structuring how DCAs are stored and structured in Entra. Entra allows you to upload the root and subordinate CA certificates to establish that kind of like chain of trust in Entra. Something to kind of be mindful of here and know is if a CA is going to define their own revocation list, CRL. For those who are aware, if you revoke a certificate on the CA, revocation is published as part of that CRL. If you don't actually define one in Entra, they don't perform that check. So we'll talk about how that can be abused later. This is an example of the preview version, the PKI version, which essentially allows you to create essentially PKI hierarchies and store your certs, your CAs in there. So in this case, I've got a SOCON PKI hierarchy, and that contains a root CA. You can see on the far right too, there is no CRL endpoint published. Next, we'll talk about user binding policies. So user binding policies essentially specify how a certificate is mapped to an Entra user. There's two types of username binding policies. There's high affinity policies and there's low affinity policies. High affinity policies essentially stands for like providing a higher assurance that one certificate maps to one user. And so you can think of that like a hash of a certificate is stored on the Entra side. So when I authenticate with this one cert, it's guaranteed to be one cert for that user. Versus a lower affinity, which is going to be more of like it's less assurance that a single certificate actually authenticates a specific user. And that's typically an example is like user principal name or emails, which is RFC 822 name, meaning that multiple certs could have that property on them versus on the higher affinity, really it's going to be like a hash of a cert. So there's only one cert available for that user. Organizations can set up multiple username binding policies. You can think of them like a priority order, a configuration order. So you can have like maybe if the first one doesn't exist, they'll check the second one, third one, fourth one, etc., until either it fails or succeeds. Here's a list of all of them that are currently available. Some are in preview. By default, principal name is mapped to user principal name. So the principal name in the cert is mapped to the user principal name in Entra. And so you can kind of see where we're going to go with that. Other kind of things to be mindful of is the on-premise user principal name. So when you set up maybe like a hybrid setup where you've got maybe an Active Directory user, when you handle doing synchronization like Entra Connect, that property, the on-premise user principal name actually syncs to Entra, and so it's actually stored on the actual account. Other ones to be mindful of, you've got things like issuer, subject, SKI, which is like a hash. SHA-1 public key is a hash of the public key and the cert, and other types of things. Here's an example of kind of how that configuration process looks in Entra. So you can kind of see here we've got, look at the bottom predominantly, you've got two different user binding configurations. Top one being principal name. So the cert field principal name will map to the user principal name Entra attribute. And then also a higher affinity one being SKI, which is in a higher affinity, and that will map to the user certificate user ID field. How that actually looks in cert world, we're going to see here we've got the example cert with the subject alternative name with the principal name here. It contains SOCON demo at my Entra tenant. That maps the user principal name in Entra, as you can see here as well. So that's how that kind of that matching works. A similar scenario with kind of on-premise synchronization looks like this. You have an on-prem account, like a user principal name, so SOCON demo at Snap Labs. That will map to the on-premise property, on-premise user principal name property in Entra here. Lastly, we'll talk about authentication binding policies, which determine the strength of the actual cert-based authentication. There's two parts to this. There's a tenant kind of wide level protection and also binding rule policies, which can override some of those tenant level protections. Binding rules essentially map certain cert-based attributes to certain protection levels. So in this case, for a tenant-wide level protection, by default, it's single factor on the authentication. So when you give a cert, it has classifies as single factor, and the affinity binding requirement is low. But you can also add custom policies where you can say if it comes from a certain issuer or has a certain policy OID or policy ID, you can make this multi-factor and so forth. And so it allows you to kind of customize based on certain CAs, certain applications, certain requirements, certain types of authentication levels. That's set up here. So you have a protection level of single factor. That's like tenant-wide. So most organizations probably want to have a tenant-wide policy of single factor just in case. The tenant affinity binding requirement is low, which means at the bottom you can kind of see what happens there is if that is high, it will not actually check any username bindings with a low affinity. It'll only check ones with high. But if it's low, it checks low and high. And then below that as well, certificate issuer, those are custom policies. So I have a Snap Labs CA. And so if anything comes from that issuer, there's no policy ID, OID kind of required. It will have a multi-factor strength and a low affinity binding below. Here's an example as well. So this cert came from this issuer. And because of that, and I can actually utilize that principal name of with the low affinity. So back to kind of that graph model, what do we kind of have in play now? So now that we've kind of talked about Entra, we've got an Entra tenant. It's comprised of two kind of main components. You have a Entra cert authority, and you have an authentication method, cert-based authentication. Cert-based authentication trusts the Entra cert authority. And below that as well, cert-based authentication is assigned to all users in the tenant, which include things like admins and users. And I create a little edge between admin and cert-based authentication just to say, admins can create with certain policy or certain permissions can create cert-based authentication and modify CAs and so forth. So this is kind of the mental model, super high level. Again, not going to be in Bloodhound, but of our mental model of our organization, and we're going to kind of discuss next of like how we can kind of cross this boundary to get access from AD to Entra. So what we commonly see in organizations that come from an on-prem background will be trying to extend on-premise infrastructure through like a hybrid trust relationship and federation configurations, and so commonly see Entra Connect. We see a lot of Okta synchronization where take the AD groups we have and throw them in Okta and assign some apps to them. That's not a bad thing. I think it's good to extend some of the functionality. The issues exist when you trust certain on-premise infrastructure that maybe isn't properly secured. And this kind of extends for anything that, when you're dealing with trust. If I trust something that is not properly secured, I inherit all the security flaws and boundaries that come with it. So you can see here, I've got a little image of the XKCD, or in this case, this image where really your security posture is kind of potentially about to crumble based on one vulnerable certificate. Microsoft also agrees, in their actual documentation, they say please make sure your PKI is secure and cannot be easily compromised, because if it is, you're screwed. Which I would say noise. Honestly, by the way, too, I'm not a researcher. I just Google. I like just to read Microsoft Docs. They tell you everything on the docs already. So, so back to our mental model. Now, kind of how do we extend it beyond this? Well, now we add a trust boundary between our Entra CA and the three certificate authorities in on-premise Active Directory. Cool. This is kind of the same configuration you guys saw before. Just some things to kind of harp on. CRL requirement is not enabled, so I don't have to have to require CRL checking or validation. Issuer hints are enabled, and then the kind of the same authentication bindings you saw before with single factor for the tenant, requiring a low affinity. All certs coming from a particular issuer have a high multi-factor, or they allow for multi-factor, and then I'm checking for the principal name in our certs. And again, this is a pretty common configuration. We pull this data for our customers, and I've seen this tons and tons of times. Cool. So let's walk through a demo or a step-by-step on how this can be abused. So same thing as before. We got a certificate. We're requesting it. In this case, I'm specifying the UPN, or the SAM in this case, to be admin@acme.com. So in this case, this is the UPN of the target Entra account. Cool. I have a valid certificate. In this case now, I go to Entra, I go to the Azure portal. It says, please sign in to Entra. I sign into Entra with the admin at acme.com account. They request me to, a certificate as part of that TLS handshake. I provide them that that certificate. They on the back end do some validation. They check one is CBA enabled. They do some CRL checking or validation. They see this is certificate actually support client authentication. They check if the authentication bindings and the username bindings to make sure it all looks good. I get the all clear. Complete the authentication process. In this case, I have an MF because the cert comes from the SnapLab CA. I have MFA, and I should be able to kind of complete or any conditional access policies there, and then I can authenticate back to the Azure portal. So here's a quick demo of it actually happening. I'm gonna try to talk through it. Hopefully this works. Typical certify goodness, requesting a certificate as the SOCON demo user. In this case, vulnerable ESC1 template on-prem AD. In this case, you can see here, I've got a certificate. We'll get to that part. In this case, just to verify, it came from the has client authentication. It came from the deliberately vulnerable ESC1 template. In this case, the user principal name in this case is the Entra UPN. When I go to Azure, I authenticate as a SOCON demo user. I click cert, authenticate with a cert. I get that prompt to use that certificate, and boom, I'm in. Awesome. So you can kind of see here, yeah, I'm authenticated as a SOCON demo user. And this user, by the way, has global admin privileges. So kind of going back to our mental model, how can we kind of expand beyond this? Well, you can abuse a typical user template if you wanted to maybe pivot from AD to Entra. Weren't really worried about too much of the escalation part, but just wanted to maybe get a foothold into Entra to do some nefarious stuff. But now you can also expand beyond this to authenticate with a misconfigured certificate to maybe obtain access to an admin user. So this is our kind of way to bridge between, because of that trust boundary, to bridge between AD and Entra. Some quick tips. It is possible to passively enumerate all users that have CBA enabled. This by targeting the get credential type endpoint on all users. It has cert auth field in the response that says true or false. If it says true, you're in luck. If it says false, you're not in luck. And there's also the cert auth URL as well. It gives you the actual URL to target. Tons of open source tools actually do this. AAD Internals has a module for it. AAD Outsider, which is just a Python port, also has that as well. So it's definitely worth, at least an operation just validating, hey, maybe the user I'm trying to target has CBA enabled, and maybe there's a good chance the boundary they trust on-premise CAs. And I kind of mentioned before too about CRL validation is not being required in CBA. If in that situation, if a cert is revoked on-prem, say you got caught and they revoked your cert on the CA, well, because if the CRL validation is not enabled in Entra, you can still authenticate to Entra with that revoked certificate. So you still have a way to maintain potentially persistence if you lose a cert, if you get burned, etc. This is a pretty common configuration for orgs that actually use ADCS as their PKI. I don't want to leave people stranded on the defensive side. I do defensive stuff nowadays, so I'm going to talk about some defensive strategies, some posture recommendations, some detection opportunities, potentially some opportunities to enable better telemetry on on-prem CAs. We'll start with hardening. Highly recommend you enforce high affinity bindings. You really want to map types that are not reusable in some degree. So it's one cert, one user. It shouldn't be the ability to have a user create multiple certs. Things like subject key identifiers, SHA-1 public keys, things that are hashed. Those are the kind of way you want to go. Implementing strict CRL validation, I highly recommend as well. Ensure that your trusted CAs also regularly publish those CRLs. I think it's important for us to, just in case something happens on-prem, if you revoke it, you should be able to kind of translate to the Entra side. Configuring authentication binding policies carefully. I think it's important to, use a combination of issuer and policy OIDs for the highest security. I probably wouldn't allow for, I'd be careful how you kind of implement cert templates, but I would, use a recommendation, tenant-wide, probably single factor. I would probably use something. If you want to have multi-factor, maybe have like, has to come from this issuer, it has to have this particular policy OID in the cert, and you have to have a pretty good kind of like intention behind it. And lastly, trust relationships. I think it's with everything, any product, any domain you work with, understanding like the relationships across multiple domains. Really trust CAs that follow best practices. Before you start enabling these kind of things, make sure you don't have vulnerable certs. Make sure your CAs are properly set up. Make sure there's no weird ACEs over your CAs. And also leverage things like conditional access policies to add additional protections and enforcements. And then from a detection perspective as well. So I'm going to take the same mental model I have. I'm going to overlay kind of where we have visibility. So first part, we have ADCS, event logs. We'll talk about some of the event logs after, but also infrastructure, like an inventory collection. So I call it inventory, but glorified word of saying LDAP collections, pulling data from LDAP, pulling data from the registry, using some of that kind of inventory context to enrich some of your detections. I think is super important to blend not just the events, but also understand how things are configured. Next, using the Entra directory audit logs is good for giving coverage around, hey, user doing weird, enabling weird CA in my environment, or enabling CBA. Your directory audit logs will give you visibility there. Entra sign-in logs will give you that kind of visibility into a user trying to authenticate with a certificate to Entra. So we'll talk about that a little bit after. Kind of hard to see at the bottom, but Entra CBA configurations, you can actually see how your certs, your CAs are configured, who's trusted, who's not. That will kind of cover your Entra CAs, and then also your Entra authentication methods on your users is available as well via the Graph API to see which users actually have CBA actually enabled on them. So what's the goal here? I think in my mind, I want to always develop robust and in very strong kind of detections. I don't like brittle or fragile kind of detections that use weak kind of indicators or signals. So my thing is, how do we kind of correlate suspicious ADCS enrollment activity with cert-based authentication in Entra? It's a few ways, a few pieces of telemetry. There's Active Directory has 4886 and 4887, cert requested, cert issued. Entra has sign-in logs. And like I said before, pulling in additional context and fidelity from your configuration data via LDAP, CVA or CA configurations that are by the Graph API and Entra will give you some visibility. Hopefully you guys can see this, and now I realize I used the wrong color, but what you kind of want to look at, like what is available from our Active Directory event logs, and I'll kind of talk through it a little bit. We'll focus predominantly on the 4887, which is when a certificate is approved and issued. That kind of happens in that event log. There's the SKI, the subject key identifier field, which essentially is like a hash of the cert. There's the subject that's in that response. There's some attributes. The CCM attribute is the source computer. CDC is the enrollment server. RMD is the source computer. Certificate template is actually the cert that was requested. And then if an alternative SAN is specified, it also exists in that log. So you can actually use that to detect, hey, SAN's a little bit weird from the actual enrollee or the actual maybe subject of the request. Ways to identify some malicious behavior. On the Entra side, here's some of the important attributes on the sign-in logs that are worth looking at. So authentication details, you can filter on X509 certificates. They'll tell you if they succeeded or failed. Additional details, actually pretty good details. They've got like user certificate subject, the issuer, serial name, which is kind of when you, it's kind of tied to the issuer a little bit. Thumbprint of the cert, the validity period, the binding identifier, if it's high, so the binding itself, the affinity mode, if it's low or high. So ways for you guys to filter on, hey, I'm seeing a lot of low affinity bindings, requested in, maybe I should go investigate that. But it's not as good as I'd like it to be, right? It's it's not the best way to kind of correlate, like, oh, user did some, requested an certificate in ADCS, and then I see that user also authenticating to Entra. I kind of want to see like the cert they requested in ADCS is the same cert they use to authenticate to Entra. And also a problem I've seen with a lot of the ADCS logs is they're not consistent. They don't populate every time. Different tools, offensive tools give you different results. Like a lot of times I don't even see the SAN. I specified alternative SAN on my certificate request. I don't even see it in 487. And so I've seen a lot of issues on the event side with AD for Active Directory certificate services. But also it's really difficult to do that cross-domain correlation. So in this case, like I want to have high affinity that the cert I requested is the same one I'm actually kind of like seeing in Entra. So what do we do? Well, there's some alternative telemetry solutions I'm still working on. I'm going to publish soon, but exploring additional functionality in Active Directory certificate services. There's this concept called an exit module, also as policy modules. They're not widely talked about, but there's the ability to actually add customizable components to Entra, or to the CA. So say when a CA issues a certificate, you can actually have an alert that's generated, or maybe go write a new event with more enriched and customizable data. These exit modules actually have visibility into cert properties on their issuance, but also on the request itself as well. So defenders can actually leverage these kind of modules to either enrich existing Windows events or also write custom events. Doing things like populating that serial number, alternative SAN, etc., that allows you to have a much more robust connection between AD and Entra. Want to also give some offensive and defensive places to look. There's some really, really interesting emerging cloud capabilities that no one really talks about, like Microsoft Cloud PKI. Essentially, it's ADCS in the cloud. So maybe worth going to explore what kind of misconfigurations or vulnerabilities exist in that cloud native PKI infrastructure. Entra ID external authentication methods, being able to register your own authentication method could be of interest to maybe compromise, persist, backdoor an account. NDES, which is Network Device Enrollment Service, SCEP, Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. Two very interesting protocols that I haven't seen a lot of research into that could be worth for extending some of the ADCS research. And I see a lot of the usage from Intune and Jamf related to those things, and maybe some other kind of interesting kind of research there. Other thing that people don't talk about a lot is, not just Entra is using cert-based authentication, but other sort of platforms. For those who are unaware, ADFS, I see that a lot of customer environments, as well as Okta. So maybe some other ways to extend this beyond Entra to other sort of domains. Also, I kind of mentioned earlier about issuer hints. Well, issuer hints, how they work is Microsoft will send via the TLS handshake the CAs that it trusts. And so potentially some ways to do some external recon to actually extract passively trusted CAs internally. It's good internal context to understand domain structure and things like that. Takeaways, just want to say security issues transcend domain boundaries in my mind. So in hybrid environments especially, we need to understand how the trust relationship of one domain can affect another domain. It's important also from a detection and response strategy, to understand how to track and correlate identities and users and infrastructure across multiple domains like on-premise, cloud, SaaS, etc. And then lastly, I wanted to kind of harp on like phishing-resistant and passive authentication methods are good. They do provide significant security benefits, but they aren't vulnerable. And so like anything, we need to understand the actual limitations of the security infrastructure that we use and the methods that we use. Then I have some additional resources. We really want to say shout out to the SpectreOps team for all the amazing work they've done. Andy Robbins, Will, all those guys, really appreciate all the work they've done. Add some cool stuff in there around exit modules and how they work, kind of in the weird PKI infrastructure part of the internet. You can find some of those things, and then some interesting resources from Microsoft. Thank you.
I was curious if the certificates would bypass any MFA requirements that happen to be on the user, or if that let them in.
I think it depends on the conditional access policy in place. I mean, of course, if it's coming from not a managed device, it might be restricted in that way. But if it's just requiring MFA, if the authentication policy allows the cert to be MFA, you would bypass MFA.
Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.